The Russia-Ukraine war has stretched on endlessly and painfully. Let us examine what has been the objective behind the war and whether as an endgame, what has been achieved, what will be achieved eventually in terms of for Russia, for Ukraine and for the world and its foreign policy at large or geopolitics at large. Let us begin as to what could have been the objective. Let's go back a little bit into 1991, the August 1991, when Soviet Union disintegrated into 15 countries. Russia, of course, turned out to be the biggest landmass and the biggest power amongst those 15 countries. About a decade later, about in 1999-2000, Putin came to power. He knew very well that for Russia to reclaim its position in the world, the way it was during the Cold War, it needed to rebuild itself, its character as well as its economic clout. And economic clout has perhaps been the pivot of this war as well. What is the main factor for Russia is its natural gas and oil reserves, its energy resources which contribute maximum to their GDP. Russia is got the largest natural gas reserves of the world, and also in terms of oil it is perhaps only second to Saudi Arabia. But it doesn't have those many warm water ports, and therefore most of the transportation of these energy resources happens through a network, wide network of pipelines which go through countries which are around it, over landmass and mostly into Europe, because Europe is highly dependent on Russia for its energy needs. And Russia in turn earns foreign exchange, which contributes nearly 1/3, about 30% of its total GDP. So that perhaps is primarily the reason which drives Russia, because the countries around it through which its pipelines go need to be secure and need to be pro-Russia. More or less, most countries around it, the breakaway republics, are in line. Ukraine also was not a problem for a very long period of time, but it is only when it started becoming a little pro-West that some alarm bells went off in Moscow, for example, after the Orange Revolution. But shortly after, when they were inviting a lot of these foreign countries to come and look at their own energy resources, Ukraine's own natural gas and energy resources to exploit Western countries. And therefore, it was a problem in Moscow, but that soon got over because a pro-Russia regime got installed in Kyiv. And that was the end of the matter. However, now with a new pro-Western Zelensky in power, and also him looking at joining NATO, him inviting the West to come and exploit the resources of the country, he was very Western or European leaning overall compared to a Moscow leaning person in terms of the type of leadership that he was providing to his country. And that had irked Moscow, and that is the reason why this war or this invasion was launched in the first place. As I said, let's examine the end game. What will it be for Ukraine, for Russia, and for the geopolitics of the world at large? To begin with Ukraine, one notices that it has been smashed to the ground. The country has faced absolute devastating onslaught. It's lost its infrastructure. It's got millions of people of its own population, lakhs of people who are refugees, and those people will need to rebuild their lives. The entire thing needs to be rebuilt from scratch, and that's going to take a vast amount of money, which is going to be a problem, especially because the areas which are its own natural resource areas are now mostly in control of Russia, even though Russia has not been able to take over the mainland as swiftly as it had anticipated or wanted. But the fact of the matter is that it has been able to capture a lot of that area of Ukraine which contains those natural gas and oil resources. And that's a huge setback for Ukraine because it was hoping to exploit those very resources earlier on to build a very prosperous economy. So even in the long term, even if it'll take years and years and years to rebuild to any semblance of normalcy, but more than that, it'll take a lot of money, and they do not have that money to rebuild. So it's going to be definitely a huge losing proposition for Ukraine, even though they have shown tremendous fortitude in facing Russia, and they have really fought on bravely much for a much longer time than was being anticipated. I think despite the fact that they have had issues in terms of their army, in terms of their structure of the army, in the command and control structure, where they've lost generals, they've lost senior personnel of the army, the fact of the matter is they've not been able to take Kyiv, and that's a setback in terms of the morale of the country or the morale of the defense forces. But the fact of the matter is they have been able to take over the Donbas area, and much earlier had annexed Crimea, which was a few years back. And that has actually been a major objective of Putin because, as I said, Ukraine's natural resources are concentrated in 3 areas, out of which 2 are Donbas and Crimea, and those are already under the control of Russia. So in terms of gas and natural gas and oil, these resources are there for Russia to exploit, even though they initially belonged to Ukraine post 1991. So that's a huge objective met. But besides that, if you look at the fact that, of course, it would also secure its pipelines going over Ukraine to a large extent, especially through that Donbas area and through Crimea and the ports, it gets those access points. In terms of strategically for the economy, it has gained, even if it has lost a lot of its reputation. But there is another negative to it, and that is that Europe has, for the first time, become very wary of Russia. For years and years, they've been importing huge amount of natural resources and oil from Russia without any problem. And this was a natural economic exchange between the countries. He's been great friends with Germany, where he's also spent time as a KGB agent earlier in Dresden, East Germany. They've had wonderful relationships, and that relationship with Europe has come under strain, and that is an issue. That is an issue, as well as the fact that Europe is now seriously looking at becoming carbon neutral. It is seriously looking at what are the alternatives to Russian oil, whether it is clean nuclear energy, or to look at other countries from where they can purchase this oil, which is a huge setback for Russia, because in days and years ahead, it will lose a large amount of its market share from Europe, which was giving it easy dollars and giving it that economic clout to stand up to the world on issues that it believed in. The third point pertains to other countries who are importing oil and resources from Russia, primarily China. Now, China is the big boy in the room. It is the largest importer of natural gas and oil from Russia. It will therefore get a huge handle, a huge leverage with Russia, knowing that Russia's relations with Europe are strained, and that Europe is now looking for alternatives. China will not only be able to buy all the oil that it wants, but it will also buy it at a discounted rate, push for absolutely good rates to be given to it, and push also Russia on not just natural resources and economy, but also to leverage it and use it for diplomatic reasons, for issues that it wants, maybe a Taiwan, maybe a Hong Kong, whatever. It knows that Russia is becoming more and more dependent on China because it is perhaps going to, in days ahead, be one of the largest sources of its own GDP, Russia's own GDP. And China knows that it will be dependent on it for money, and therefore it will want to maneuver Russia or arm twist Russia into backing it on foreign policy issues, on international forums, that China would want to use and will use Russia in the way they want to use it. So I think Russia is a big loser on that front, and it will change the geopolitics in the world, also in the context of India, where we've always, even when there's been a China-India conflict, we've always depended on Russia to a very large extent, but Russia will now have to walk the tightrope, because it will also understand that it has to keep China humored in days ahead, considering that it's losing the Western market and already has lost its reputation, and Europe is definitely looking at reducing its dependency on Russia. So the fallout for China would be a positive one. India would need to be a little wary, will need to understand and figure out the new dynamics, the new unfolding dynamics, where Russia and China are going to be a lot closer than before. Of course, the future also depends on Vladimir Putin's own health, which is under speculation. And there's so much speculation, from dementia to Alzheimer's to whether he's suffering from cancer or whatever, whether there's any truth in it or not. But the fact of the matter is, his health will be critical, considering that he's the lone person who's been giving Russia leadership and spearheading that country for over 2 decades. And most of its policy and its outlook to the world is totally dependent on the way Putin has conceived it. So years ahead will depend on that. But the biggest takeaway from the Russia-Ukraine war is that China would be the biggest gainer.